Hey guys, Michael J. Crawford here, and welcome to part 1 of my review of Section 31. And I don't know why I'm doing this. All right, so first and foremost, I do need to explain, if you're new to one of my full-length reviews of a film, which I haven't done one in some time, I used to use a system called the Official Anti-Tracker Objective-Subjective Film Quotient, or OTIS for short. However, things have changed. It's a different era, so we needed to rebrand, if you will. So, the new official name of this type of review system is the Salty Plus Objective-Subjective Film Quotient. After all, I don't think that there's any denying that Sposivkuk is much easier to say than it. Yeah. Anyway, so if you are wondering how the system works, it's actually quite simple. On the other side of the screen from my beautiful face, you will see 3 turds. A red turd that represents bad things, a yellow turd that represents neutral things, and a green turd that represents good things. As we go through the entire film, scene by scene, I will in fact assign 1, 2, or 3 turds to each color group whenever I see something that either strikes me as bad, really bad, or downright offensive, or all the way up to good, really good, or mind-bogglingly awesome. So I can honestly say at this point that I have no idea what the final score of this review will in fact be as far as number of red turds, yellow turds, and green turds assigned to the entirety of the film. I would also invite you throughout the course of this review, if you see something that you think I am in error about, please bring it up in the comments. I have been known to change my mind, or if someone corrects me in something that I said that was factually mistaken, to retract or add turds as necessary in order to make sure that we come up with a correct score. At the end of the review, we will run this through what's called the singing physics equation. Why is it called the singing physics equation? Because a YouTuber who I unfortunately lost contact with years ago, who was called Singing Physics, came up with this equation for me in order to determine what the final score out of 10 would be based on the number of turds that have been assigned. But more on that when we get to the end of this review. For now, I really have been trying to put this off. Let's talk about Section 31. Okay, so to start off, I know that a lot of people on YouTube will take a visual image from a movie or TV show and mirror it so that the copyright bots are less likely to be alerted of their presence. But I did not do that. No, this is actually how the movie starts, because apparently, since George used from the Mirror Universe, they want to heavily imply that this is a Mirror Universe story. And the problem is that really there's 2 characters, well, maybe 3, that are from the Mirror Universe that we see in the story, but the entirety of the story takes place in the so-called Prime Universe. So this is kind of a misleading intro, to be honest with you. I'm not real happy with it, because I think it probably would have been better had this been a Mirror Universe story. So one of the first visuals we're treated to is this ridiculously oversized title card that says The Terran Empire, which of course is what the Federation is referred to as within the mirror universe. The problem is that, and I know this may sound like a stupid nitpick, but I really do have kind of an issue with this. It doesn't give us a date, or at least say something like 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, or last week, or something, so that we get an idea of exactly when this all takes place. And I think there's a reason for that. I genuinely, and I'm not making this up, I don't think that the writers of this movie know when it takes place. And so they're really afraid to commit to anything. So they're not, they give one star date, which we'll talk about that when we get to it. But other than that, there's really no indicator of exactly when this takes place. And that one star date basically creates a whole lot of contradictions, which we will get into. In this particular case, we are introduced to a young Philippa Georgiou of Star Trek Discovery fame. And we find out that she and her lover are the sole survivors of a mirror universe version of the Hunger Games, in which a bunch of young people had to compete and basically kill each other off so that the survivor becomes the new emperor and the runner-up becomes the emperor's personal slave. Okay. What? Okay. Okay. Look, I know this is just, it hurts my brain to even think about this. It makes no logical sense whatsoever. And don't get me wrong, I understand that the Terrans of the Terran Empire are evil and twisted and all that, but there was no indication that this couldn't even work in the Terran Empire, because we've seen in prior incarnations of the Terran Empire that the most common way of advancing yourself, whether in your career, is to assassinate the person above you, and then you move up in rank. And this does go all the way up to the Emperor, as we saw in A Mirror Darkly, when Hoshi Sato assassinated Archer, who was about to become the Emperor, and so then she becomes the first Empress. This scene with the Hunger Games thing, honestly, and then the entire military shows up to bow down before her, makes no sense to me whatsoever. And by the way, what does she do? She kills her entire family. That's the final test, and that's the thing that her lover, who's the only other contestant, can't do. So let me make sure I understand this, because Philippa Georgiou is the hero of this story. Now, anti-hero, sure, but she's still the protagonist of the story. And the way that we're introducing her is for her to kill her entire family. How? This doesn't make any... Breathe. Okay, so I really am at a loss here, because it makes no sense. And honestly, and this kind of gets to what I was thinking as far as how would I correct this, because it's one thing, any of us can critique a movie, but can we fix it? Or is this movie truly beyond redemption? I think it can be fixed. And we're going to be talking about that on Nerd Fights this Wednesday with me and Mr. Know-It-All. But I'm going to talk about some of the stuff here because, well, this is where we are in the movie. With this particular sequence, I think the fix is fairly simple. Instead of having Philippa Georgiou show up after winning some kind of Hunger Games competition and assassinate her family. And by the way, why is her family living like it's, Bronze Age China? I don't understand. That doesn't make any sense. How about we actually have them in the Terran Empire that we know? And so let's erase all that for a second. And instead, we have our opening sequence of young Philippa Georgiou entering into a dining hall after she had just prepared a very fancy meal for her family, which includes Empress Hoshi Sato. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, Salty, that makes no sense. Well, it kind of does. If you look at the timeline of things Granted, I know the timeline of this show is really messed up anyway, but we'll talk about that. However, Star Trek Discovery takes place some 14 years or so prior to Star Trek, the original series, right? Which would still put it some 80-odd years after Star Trek Enterprise. So there's an 80-year gap, roughly, between Enterprise and Discovery. Now, again, it would have been helpful if the Terran Empire title card actually had a date on it, but it does not. However, the actress, man, I'm going to butcher her name. It's Miku Martineo or something like that. She is, at the time of filming, was 20 years old. She was born in 2004. Meanwhile, Michelle Yeoh is 62 years old. She talked about in my last video about this. So if we were to say that this flashback happened, say, 30 years prior to Star Trek Discovery, because Discovery obviously was a few years prior to this. So let's just go 30 years. So we'll say that Georgiou was somewhere in her 50s during Discovery, and then we flash back to when she was 20, so it would have been, roughly a 30-year jump. Well, now that 80-year gap between Enterprise and Discovery is down to 50 years. And so it's entirely reasonable to think that young Hoshi Sato, who was in her 20s when we saw her in Star Trek Enterprise, would be in her 70s now. So it's totally reasonable that Empress Hoshi Sato would still be the Empress and, in fact, could be Georgiou's, say, grandmother. Now, some people might be freaking out saying, but Hoshi is Japanese and clearly Philippa is Chinese. But you're basing that, we don't really know what Philippa's full family tree is, and there's nothing that says she couldn't have had a Japanese grandmother. And honestly, who cares? I mean, John Cho could play Sulu. I don't see any kind of conflict here. But anyway, so if Philippa Georgiou was in fact the direct descendant of Hoshi Sato, then Philippa, preparing a fine meal for her family, murders her family in order to ascend to being Empress without the need for the Hunger Games crap. And this would all fall in line with what we've seen of the Mirror Universe before. She kills the Empress, therefore she becomes the new Empress. So as for San, her lover in the original version, I would keep him around, but I wouldn't obviously have him be a fellow contestant in the Hunger Games. Rather, you make him, say, one of the chefs that works in the kitchen and her co-conspirator in poisoning her family. After the family is dead, then in a similar fashion to what we saw, she would make sure to put him in his place, and he would become her personal servant for the foreseeable future.
In 2257, she was brought to our universe and joined Section 31. But after a few years, we lost contact.
You might think that I'm going to criticize the fact that somehow Section 31 has footage of Georgiou stepping into the Guardian of Forever, which, by the way, took place several hundred years in the future, so they would have no idea that happened. And you'd be right. That was absolutely insane. How is it that they have footage of events that will not happen for like 900 years? There's no explanation. It just kind of happens. Whatever. On top of this, now we do get another firm date here, which I didn't catch on my first viewing, which is that the voiceover from Control, which I can't believe they actually recycled the name Control after what happened in Discovery Season 2, but whatever. So Control, a.k.a. Jamie Lee Curtis, is telling them that in 2257, Georgiou joined Section 31, but then she disappeared, right? So that basically sums up the events of the first two seasons of Star Trek Discovery. Fine. But
Recently, Giorgio was spotted using an alias in the border territory outside Federation space.
now they're trying to play coy with what the date is. They just say, recently she showed up again. Well, how long was she gone? Was it a year? Was it 5 years? Was it 100 years? We have no clue. They don't try to fill it in. And there's good reason for that, because no matter what the answer is, it's inherently contradictory to what we see in the future. It's really, really mind-numbingly bad. However, I want to take a quick look at this map that they showed. Because, well, could that be a clue as to when this takes place? Well, no, because the map itself is a contradiction. Okay, so maybe I'm wrong, but looking at this map, it seems pretty clear that the orange line delineates the border of Federation territory. And the narrator clearly says that Georgiou is staying at a base outside of Federation territory. All that would be perfectly consistent, except that we have a whole host of Federation planets, including one star base, that are on the wrong side of this border. Now, the only logical explanation would be that the only region that's truly outside of Federation space is the orange blocky area that Georgiou's base happens to be in. But we have both the planets of Zarin and Maxia inside of that orange area, and both of which are member planets of the United Federation of Planets. So the map just doesn't make a lick of sense. But that's okay. We just know that Giorgiou is there. Now, as far as my attempt at fixing this particular movie, I wouldn't change much about this particular scene except to make the map actually make sense. So here we get the one and only star date we're going to get for this entire film. And this is where everything really falls apart for me as far as trying to place us into the Star Trek timeline at all. You see, the star date is actually fairly consistent with if this is a direct sequel to Star Trek Discovery, and when Giorgiou went back in time through the Guardian of Forever, she ended up going back to exactly where she came from. That would mean that stardate 1292.4 is shortly before Star Trek the Original Series. And the reason this would make sense is, as I showed in the intro to my last video, the earliest stardate ever recorded from the original series is actually later than this.
Captain's log. Stardate 1312.4. The impossible has happened.
So yeah, it makes perfect sense that this takes place approximately 20 days, in fact, exactly 20 days, before Captain Kirk takes the Enterprise to the outside edge of the galaxy, causing Gary Mitchell to gain godlike powers, etc., etc. But then we run into another problem. So I have seen from multiple people their claims that this actually takes place much, much later, that this takes place in the early 24th century, not in the 23rd century like Star Trek the Original Series. But the star date just doesn't line up. I don't know where people are getting this. Further, if in fact this does take place some 40 years prior to Star Trek The Next Generation, which is what people are claiming, that somehow, and people go so far, like on Screen Rant, as to say that it takes place exactly on April 17th, 2324. Now, I don't know what system they're using to convert star dates into dates, but that would mean that the original series must take place after April 17th, 2324, which makes no sense, right? So either way, that the star date and the Gregorian calendar date do not make sense, or at least if we're going to consider the original series of Star Trek to be canonical. If the original series is not canonical, fine, it doesn't matter. Then the second problem you run into, though, is that they also clearly established that in 2257 is when Georgiou came into the Prime Universe and joined Section 31. We also know, spoiler alert for later on in this, she kills San before she comes to the Prime Universe, which means, let's just say, hypothetically, it was less than a year prior that she killed him. So in 2257, she kills San. However, San actually faked his own death and now is coming back for revenge. But if this takes place in 2364, so 100+ years later, how is San still alive? And even if he is still alive, why does he look like he's about the same age as Empress Georgiou? Now, maybe he's some alien race that ages slowly or something, but there's nothing on screen to indicate that. By all appearances, he seems to be human. And we also establish, and particularly in the Discovery era, that the Terran Empire is extremely xenophobic, and it's like human first all the way. So it would be highly unlikely that a non-human would even be in the competition to be the next emperor. So no matter how you slice it, the dates here make no sense. Now, you also run into the Rachel Garrett problem. They throw Rachel Garrett in as kind of a fan service, I guess, except that she sucks. And so the Rachel Garrett, though, is obviously younger than the Rachel Garrett that we get in Star Trek The Next Generation. And when I did the math as far as the dates, if the star date is correct and lines up with the original series, then that means that this Rachel Garrett in Star Trek The Next Generation is 111 years old. However, if the star date is actually translates to 2364, then Rachel Garrett's age is fixed, but then San is like about 150 years old. So this is just, I quit. I can't, no. I'm not doing this review. No, I'm not doing it. No, forget it. I'm sorry, guys. I can't. Bye.
Well, Salty sat down to review Section 31. He figured giving his thoughts might be fun, but he quickly realized he went down the wrong path when he looked at Rachel and San's age and did the math. It became even more apparent Section 31 was lame when he realized he had seen this before when he watched the Hunger Games. It truly seems like good Trek may be gone, but thanks anyway to my friends on Patreon: Jason Rogers, Sean Gack,